By the year 800 BC, the Aryan, or Indo-European, pantheon had spread its reach from the ends of Europe to western China, delving further into India and Mesopotamia, encountering strange and hostile gods along the way, all who quailed under the menacing storm cloud of Deus Beta. Some gods disappeared into oblivion, others clung to a diminished existence by accepting the new rulership, still affecting the world, albeit in minor ways, syncretizing little parts of themselves into the new religion. The success of Zeus, or Deus Beta, and his relations, also served as a limiting detriment. Stretched so thin, their subjects began to change and acquire new names for their deities, implement new ideas and tongues, even so far as becoming corrupted by their encounters with foreign gods. In India, ancestor worship became replaced with the concept of personal reincarnation. Here, encountering a people most foreign, and a host of scattered gods beyond count, the Aryans developed the caste system to stave off subsumation. Yet rule over such a diverse and far-flung land could only be maintained through diplomacy and integration, and much of the land to the south remained out of reach. Some pre-Aryan upper classes were allowed to maintain themselves as client rulers, and among these grew tendrils of new traditions, born out of a desire to undermine the Aryan priest class. The Shramana movement would grow from a mere preservation of pre-Aryan priestly practices to all-encompassing worldly concepts that would challenge the Aryan grip upon the known world, culminating in Jainism and Buddhism. Here a most dangerous subversion began. The separation of classes was smashed. The ascetic practices of the priest were not only exacerbated to ridiculous extremes, but encouraged upon the whole populace. An impossible standard for a society to maintain. Should the roles of warrior, farmer and merchant become only that of priest, then the whole society would grow weak and perish. Mahavira was a prince who popularized Jainism around 550 BC. Gautama Buddha was likewise a prince of a mixed origin dynasty, the Shakya clan, who maintained pre-Aryan practices and who created Buddhism around 550 BC. A Shramana movement aimed at the masses. Both arose in the Magadha kingdom, on the eastern rim of Aryan influence. Jainism preached severe asceticism, renouncement of material wealth, and non-violence, in order to gain a better reincarnation. Buddha applied a slightly different tact, preaching a middle way, allowing moderation in sensual pleasure, a more moderate form of asceticism, but still maintaining the line of non-violence and renouncement of material wealth, with the made-up aim of a better reincarnation. This tact appealed far more to the masses. Both Jainism and Buddhism would co-opt the ancient Aryan swastika, slightly reforming its mystical representation of the cycles of the universe into their more solidified concept of personal reincarnation. Like Jesus, Buddha would gain apostles, or disciples, 60 in number, and send them out into the world to spread the new message, himself included, assuming he ever actually existed. Much of his life is shrouded in myth, as is the case with many emergent, revolutionary figures of ancient times. Kingdoms beyond the Aryan sphere of influence would offer financial patronage to the new movement, allowing it to grow quite rapidly. Buddha's chief patron was an Athapindika, a wealthy merchant and banker of uncertain origin. Buddha rejected the Vedas, the sacred texts of the Aryan Brahmin priest class. Likewise, he rejected the Brahmanical rites and practices, disputed the Brahmins' claim to superior birth, claimed that all men were born equal, and decided that race and blood was irrelevant. It was a clear challenge to Aryan rule. Buddhism, boosted by this initial financial backing and the support of the Magadhan kings, would spread gradually along the trade routes, aiming to convert the rich, conning them into handing over their material wealth, much like Christianity would do later on. This contradiction of renouncement of wealth while the controllers hoard it, as well as a preaching of equality while the herd is managed by the few, can be witnessed in all proto-communist and modern communist movements. Like Christianity, Buddhism required a few centuries before it could attract enough wealth to back a ruler who would take over northern Aryan India. Exploiting the disarray caused by Alexander the Great's invasion, The Magadhan Empire under the Mauryan dynasty would conquer the region. 2 generations later, its leader Ashoka would enable Buddhism to become the dominant religion in the empire. Brahmins persisted, although they would be forced to adopt many practices of Buddhism, and only through syncretization did they survive, their original teachings degenerating into what we now label Hinduism. Hinduism would eventually return as the dominant religion upon Buddhism's designed inability to combat the incursion of a more aggressive enemy, Islam. Bordering northern India occurred yet another religious revolution at the same time. Zarathustra's religion, Zoroastrianism, was a direct attack on the control of the Aryan priest class, the Magi, just as Buddhism had done in India. It maligned much of the old Aryan pantheon, the Devas, most notably the gods of war, the driving force behind hypermasculine Aryan dominance, while co-opting the Ahuras and renaming them. A clear response to this attack can be seen in Aryan India, where, presently under religious assault upon both sides, they elevated the Devas to a higher benevolence and maligned the Ahuras, or Asuras, now under control of the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda, as demons. Much of Zarathustra's life is cloaked in myth, just as the Buddha's, and just as with the Buddha, it is not certain if such a figure ever existed. Regardless, a suggestion of a merchant origin may be detected in his name. Hypophoric names like Vishtaspa, Aspa meaning horse, Vishtaspa being the first king Zarathustra apparently tricked with magic into supporting the new religion, show the value placed on horses, whereas camelophoric names like Zarathustra, Ustra meaning camel, show the importance of the Bactrian camel, an animal well adapted to the harsh conditions of the steppe and desert regions of Central Asia, and much used by merchants. In Greco-Roman literature, Zarathustra's patron was the pseudo-anonymous author of a set of prophecies written under his name, perhaps intimating that Zarathustra was a literary character of mythology rather than a real person. Zoroastrianism would rise to predominance as Cyrus the Great's Persian kingdom arose. Following the unification of the Median and Persian empires in 550 BC, Cyrus the Great, and later his son Cambyses II, would curtail the powers of the Magi after the Aryan priests had apparently attempted to sow dissent following their loss of influence to Zoroastrianism. In 522 BC, the Magi revolted and set up a rival claimant to the throne. The usurper, pretending to be Cyrus's younger son Smerdis, took power shortly thereafter. Owing to the despotic rule of Cambyses and his long absence in Egypt, the whole people, Persians, Medes, and all the other nations acknowledged the usurper, especially as he granted a remission of taxes for 3 years. But he would later be challenged and undone, and the ancient Aryan Magi became replaced thereafter with the Zoroastrian Magi, though a hint of their existence may be detected later on in a Zoroastrian schism movement called Thurvanism, which would take power under the Sassanids, but would eventually fall to Islam. Evidently financial support from Zoroastrianism for Cyrus's wars, notably against the Medes, where the pre-Zoroastrian Magi held the center of power, played a significant part in the shift of influence. It did not preach a suicidal denial of the world, nor non-violence, but it spread the concept of monotheism, messianism, and an eschatology on the same timeline as that of Jewish eschatology, with a very similar story. Quote, in ancient Zoroastrian eschatology, a 3,000-year struggle between good and evil will be fought, punctuated by evil's final assault. During the final assault, the sun and moon will darken, and humankind will lose its reverence for religion, family, and elders. The world will fall into winter, and Angramenu's most fearsome miscreant, Azidahaka, will break free and terrorize the world. According to legend, the final savior of the world, known as the Saoshyant, will be born to a virgin impregnated by the seed of Zoroaster while bathing in a lake. The Saoshyant will raise the dead, including those in all after-worlds, for final judgment, returning the wicked to hell to be purged of bodily sin. Next, All will wade through a river of molten metal in which the righteous will not burn, but through which the impure will be completely purified. The forces of good will ultimately triumph over evil, rendering it forever impotent, but not destroyed. The Saoshyant and Ahura Mazda will offer a bull as a final sacrifice for all time, and all humans will become immortal. End quote. It would also encourage a practice of extreme honesty among the people, so much so that it made them both prey of and incapable of competing with foreign merchants who had no issue with deceit and lying for gain. The simplified dichotomy of good versus evil aim to render the people childlike and obedient. Friedrich Nietzsche, in his aim to help the Aryan man evolve to a higher state, would choose Zarathustra as his character to mock this dichotomy, and would title one of his most famous works, Beyond Good and Evil. Zoroastrianism would remain supreme for several centuries until later becoming challenged by a persisting Aryan religion, that of Hellenism. Alexander the Great would burn the Zoroastrian texts after conquering Persepolis, and Hellenism would reign over the lands for several centuries until the Greeks lost control to the Parthians. Across the other side of the known world, at the far eastern reaches of Aryan influence, there was perhaps another revolt around the same time period. Confucius was an agent of the Duke of Song who set up schools, which recruited further agents of subversion who then infiltrated other governments. The Duchy of Song was a leftover state of the ancient Shang dynasty who had been conquered by the chariot-riding Western Zhou dynasty around 1000 BC. The Zhou dynasty was related to the Aryans, known as Western barbarians. Figurines with Caucasoid features have been found in excavations of Zhou dynasty palaces. The amount of Aryan influence is debatable, certainly not overwhelming, but it is definitely present to some degree. It remains present until the first emperor of China in 221 BC, who we know for a fact used Aryans as mercenaries. Like Jainism and Buddhism, Confucianism would co-opt the Aryan swastika. Harmony with the gate of heaven and the cycles of the universe would thenceforth only be accomplished through Confucianist teachings. Beyond that, there is nothing ideologically sinister about the revolution. Merchants reaching the end of the road had also reached the end of their influence, and likely only wanted a change in order, unable to exert any serious control over affairs. In Mesopotamia, the Jewish Torah was written and compiled around the same time period. Like Zoroastrianism, Jews helped fund Cyrus the Great, also helping to subvert Babylon so as to enable an easy conquest. In turn, Cyrus helped them build the Second Temple. Zoroastrianism and Judaism share many elements, most notably a monotheistic revolt against pantheism. The Aryan and Semitic pantheons share many traits and stories. Aryans had taken over Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, had once ruled Babylon through the Kassite Hammurabi, had pervaded every inch of the region, as recently as the Scythians, who had raided into Egypt only a century before the Torah was written. Evidently, much of the Semitic pantheon was a syncretization of the conquering Aryan pantheon. Jews revolted and wrote a script warring against it, detailing a desire to concentrate all the wealth of the world into their hands. Like Zoroastrianism, they would suffer under Hellenic rule, then wither under Aryan Roman dominance. In this period, they adopted the pacifying Buddhist strategy to create the character of Jesus Christ, who would similarly revolt against the Aryan Roman religion. Christianity would proceed to wipe out the last phase of the Aryan pantheon, and consequently hand the Jews the banking monopoly, as demonstrated in detail in my previous video, the Great Theological War against Rome. The Aryan peoples, after conquering much of the known world through the implementation of the horse, had proven a difficult obstacle for merchants and priests to corrupt. They spurred themselves on through a hypermasculine culture of war, avoiding a sedentary lifestyle. Because every man was expected to become a warrior, outsiders could not use money to raise and dictate the strength of armies, and so control geopolitics and gain influence over kings. Aryan leaders could easily raise their own forces with limited funds. Therefore, a new religious revolution had proved necessary, if the merchants and old priests were to regain the control they had lost. The foreign priests had previously attempted via syncretization to corrupt and degenerate the Aryan gods, but only with limited success. Even when under degenerate influence, Aryan man remained quite powerful. Thus a radical universalist approach proved necessary to undermine the connection of blood and religion. Aryan man would repeat his feats through the harnessing of shipcraft, thereafter conquering the whole world, but the religion he would spread would be molded by another people from the start, piggybacking on and manipulating Aryan success for their own benefit.
If you enjoyed this documentary, check out my classical fantasy series on Amazon, The Spirit and the Serpent.